Chapter 1. A Whisper of War. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the small town of Mariinka, nestled in the eastern reaches of Ukraine. The gentle hum of daily life filled the air. The distant clatter of dishes being washed, the laughter of children playing in the streets, and the occasional bark of a dog chasing after a stray cat. For the Kulish family, it was just another day in a life they cherished. Dmytro Kulish wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood back to admire his work. The new kitchen table he had crafted for a neighbor gleamed in the late afternoon light. Its surface smooth and polished, every detail meticulously carved. As a carpenter, Dmytro took pride in his work, finding satisfaction in the tangible results of his labor. He loved his craft, not just for the beauty it could create, but for the stability it provided his family. "Papa, look what I made!" came a shout from behind him. Dmytro turned to see his 12-year-old daughter, Sofia, running towards him, her auburn hair bouncing with each step. In her hands, she held a small wooden birdhouse, the paint still fresh and slightly smudged. Dmytro smiled, taking the birdhouse from her and inspecting it with a craftsman's eye. "You did a fine job, Sofia," he said, nodding approvingly. "The birds will be lucky to have such a nice home." Sofia beamed with pride, her green eyes sparkling. "I'm going to hang it in the tree by the window so we can watch them," she said, already planning where to place her creation. "Make sure it's secure," Dmytro advised, handing it back to her. "We don't want it falling during the next storm." As Sofia ran off, Dmytro watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with love. She was growing up so fast, already showing signs of inheriting his passion for working with his hands. He turned back to his tools, carefully placing them in his worn leather bag, every movement precise and deliberate. The familiar routine brought him comfort, grounding him in the midst of a world that was slowly becoming more unpredictable. Inside the house, Iryna was busy in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The rich aroma of borscht filled the small cozy space, mingling with the scent of freshly baked bread. 5-year-old Bohdan sat at the kitchen table, his small hands occupied with a set of colorful blocks. His bright blue eyes were focused, his tongue peeking out from the corner of his mouth as he carefully stacked the blocks into a precarious tower. "Careful, Bohdan," Iryna warned gently as she stirred the pot on the stove. "You don't want it to fall." Bohdan grinned at her, his chubby cheeks dimpled with the effort of a concentration. "It's going to be the tallest tower ever," he declared, his voice filled with the innocent determination only a child could muster. Iryna smiled, her heart warming at the sight of her youngest child's enthusiasm. Despite the growing tensions in the world outside, within these walls her family was safe, happy, and whole. It was a simple life, but one that she wouldn't trade for anything. As she set the table, the radio in the corner of the kitchen crackled to life with the evening news. The announcer's voice was calm, almost monotonous, as he listed the day's events. But then his tone shifted, growing more somber as he reported on the escalating situation in the east. Reports indicate a significant increase in military activity along the Ukrainian border, the announcer said. The situation remains tense, with diplomatic efforts failing to de-escalate the conflict. Citizens are advised to stay informed and take necessary precautions. Iryna's hand paused mid-motion, the spoon she was holding hovering over the pot. She exchanged a glance with Dmytro, who had just entered the kitchen. His face, usually so calm and reassuring, was clouded with concern. Do you think it will reach us? She asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dmytro sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I don't know, he admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. But we need to be prepared, just in case. Iryna nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had hoped that the conflict would remain far from their home, that their town would be spared from the violence that was slowly creeping across the country. But as the days passed, it was becoming harder to ignore the signs. Let's not worry the children, Dmytro said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll keep an eye on the news. And if things get worse, we'll decide what to do then. Iryna took a deep breath and forced a smile, pushing the fear to the back of her mind. You're right, she agreed. No need to worry them until we have to. Dmytro leaned down and kissed her on the forehead, his touch warm and comforting. We'll get through this, Iryna. We always do. She nodded, feeling a little of the tension ease from her shoulders. I know, she whispered, leaning into him for a brief moment of solace before turning back to the stove. As they sat down to dinner, the family fell into their usual routine, the children's chatter filling the room with a sense of normalcy. But beneath the surface, the whisper of war lingered, casting a shadow over their peaceful life. Later that evening, after the children had been put to bed, Dmytro and Iryna sat together on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around them. The stars twinkled above, seemingly untouched by the troubles of the world below. We need to have a plan, Dmytro said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Just in case. Iryna nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. What do you think we should do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. If things get worse, we should leave, Dmytro replied, his voice steady. Head west, towards Poland. It will be safer there. Iryna felt a pang of fear at the thought of leaving their home, the place where they had built their life together. But she knew Dmytro was right. Their children's safety had to come first. Okay, she agreed softly. If it comes to that, we'll go. They sat in silence for a while longer, the reality of their situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. The world was changing around them, and they would have to change with it. But as long as they had each other, Iryna knew they would find a way to endure. For now, though, all they could do was wait and hope that the whisper of war would remain just that, a whisper. Chapter 2. The heart-wrenching decision. The sound of distant explosions shattered the early morning calm, echoing through the quiet streets of Mariinka. Iryna jolted awake, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. But the fear in Dmytro's eyes as he sat up beside her confirmed that this was no nightmare. It's happening, he whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. He threw back the covers and hurried to the window, peering out into the pre-dawn darkness. The orange glow on the horizon sent a chill down his spine. Iryna scrambled out of bed, her hands trembling as she pulled on a sweater. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The plan they had discussed in hushed tones only days before now felt terrifyingly real. We need to leave, Dmytro said, turning to her with a look of grim determination. We can't wait any longer. The war is here. Iryna nodded, her mind racing. She knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning their home, everything they had built, filled her with a sense of dread. What about the children? She asked, her voice trembling. How do we explain this to them? We don't have time to explain, Dmytro replied, already moving towards the door. We'll tell them on the way. We need to pack what we can and get out of here. Iryna swallowed hard, fighting back the rising panic. Okay, she said, her voice steadier now. I'll wake them up. You start packing the essentials. Dmytro nodded and disappeared into the hallway, his footsteps echoing through the silent house. Iryna took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and made her way to the children's room. Sofia was already awake, sitting up in bed with a worried expression on her face. Mama, what's happening? She asked, her voice small and scared. Iryna forced a reassuring smile, though her heart was breaking inside. We have to go on a little trip, sweetheart, she said, kneeling beside her daughter's bed. There's some trouble nearby, and it's safer for us to leave Mariinka for a while. Is it the war? Sofia asked, her voice trembling. She was too smart for her age, already understanding more than Iryna had hoped. Yes, Iryna admitted, stroking Sofia's hair gently. But we're going to be okay. We just need to move quickly. Sofia nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but filled with trust in her mother's words. Iryna kissed her forehead, and then turned her attention to Bohdan, who was still fast asleep, clutching his stuffed bear. Bohdan, Iryna whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. Wake up, my love. We need to go. Bohdan stirred and blinked up at her, confused. Where are we going, Mama? He asked sleepily, rubbing his eyes. We're going on an adventure, Iryna said, trying to keep her voice light. But we have to leave right now, okay? Bohdan nodded, too drowsy to fully understand what was happening. Iryna quickly helped him get dressed, then grabbed a small bag she had prepared earlier with their most important belongings. A few changes of clothes, some food, and their family's documents. When they entered the living room, Dmytro was already there, stuffing clothes into a large backpack. He looked up as they approached, his face lined with worry. We need to hurry, he said, his voice tense. I've heard reports of fighting near the town. We don't have much time. Iryna nodded, trying to suppress the wave of fear threatening to overwhelm her. What about the neighbors? She asked. Should we warn them? Dmytro shook his head, his expression pained. I'm sure they've heard the same sounds we have. Everyone's doing what they can to survive. We have to focus on getting our family to safety. Iryna understood, though it broke her heart to think of leaving their friends and neighbors behind. But she knew Dmytro was right. They couldn't save everyone. All they could do was protect their own. Let's go, she said, her voice steady now. She reached for Sofia's hand, while Dmytro scooped up Bohdan, who clung to his father's neck, still half asleep. They stepped out into the cold morning air, the sky just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The streets, usually filled with the sounds of daily life, were eerily silent. Here and there, a few neighbors hurried down the road, their arms full of hastily packed belongings. The tension was palpable, a shared understanding that their lives would never be the same again. Dmytro led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, every sound seeming louder in the quiet. As they reached the edge of town, they saw a line of cars and people gathered at the makeshift checkpoint. Ukrainian soldiers, their faces grim and determined, were stopping everyone, checking documents, and giving directions to those fleeing west. Dmytro's heart sank as he realized what was happening. He knew the reports. Conscription had begun in earnest, and able-bodied men were being pulled into service to defend their country. He squeezed Iryna's hand, his face pale. "We need to stay calm," he whispered to her. "Just keep moving forward. Don't stop unless we have to." Iryna nodded, her grip on Sofia's hand tightening. She could feel the tension radiating off Dmytro, but there was nothing they could do but continue. The line moved slowly, inching closer to the soldiers. When they finally reached the front, a soldier stepped forward, his eyes assessing Dmytro. "Papers," he said curtly, holding out his hand. Dmytro handed over their documents, his heart pounding. The soldier glanced through them, then looked up at Dmytro, his expression unreadable. "You're being conscripted," the soldier said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Report to the staging area down the road. Your family can continue without you." Iryna felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, he's our only protection. We can't do this without him." The soldier's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mom, but we need every man we can get. The war is here, and we have to defend our homes." Dmytro's heart ached as he looked at his family, the thought of leaving them almost unbearable. He knelt down in front of Sofia and Bohdan, his voice choked with emotion. "Listen to me," he said, taking their hands in his. "You're going to be strong for your mother, okay? You're going to take care of each other, and you're going to get to Poland. I'll find you when this is all over." Sofia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling. Bohdan didn't fully understand what was happening, but the fear in his sister's eyes made him cling to his father even tighter. "Don't go, Papa," he whimpered, his small voice filled with desperation. Dmytro hugged them both tightly, his own tears threatening to spill over. "I love you both so much," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He then turned to Iryna, his heart breaking at the sight of her tear-streaked face. "I'll find you," he promised, his voice fierce with determination. "No matter what, I'll find you." Iryna nodded, her voice too choked with emotion to speak. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss filled with all the love and fear she couldn't put into words. The soldier cleared his throat, a gentle reminder that time was running out. Dmytro reluctantly pulled away from his family, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was leaving behind. "Go," he urged them, his voice cracking. "Get to Poland. I'll come for you." Iryna took a deep breath, her heart breaking as she turned to lead the children away. Every step felt like a betrayal, a tearing away of the life they had known. But she forced herself to keep moving, knowing that she had to be strong for her children. As they walked away, Bohdan turned back, his small voice calling out, "Papa!" over and over, his little hand waving frantically. Dmytro stood there, watching them go, every fibre of his being screaming to run after them. But he knew he couldn't. He had to stay and fight for their future, for the chance to see them again. As the distance between them grew, the reality of their separation settled in like a heavy weight on Iryna's chest. She kept her eyes forward, not daring to look back, knowing that if she did, she might not be able to keep going. Sofia clung to her mother's hand, her small body trembling with silent sobs. Bohdan, too young to fully understand, simply looked back over his shoulder, his tear-streaked face searching for the father who had always been there. Iryna's heart broke anew with every step, but she knew there was no turning back. They had to reach Poland. Chapter 3. The Long Road West. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale light over the landscape as Iryna, Sofia and Bohdan continued their journey westward. The road was clogged with other refugees, families, elderly couples, and lone travelers, all fleeing the same unseen terror that had upended their lives overnight. The air was thick with tension, the low murmur of anxious voices mixing with the distant sound of artillery fire, a constant reminder of the war they were trying to escape. Iryna clutched Bohdan's hand tightly, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Sofia walked close by her side, her face pale and drawn. The events of the morning had shaken them all, and the reality of their situation was settling in like a heavy weight on their hearts. The warmth of the rising sun did little to comfort them as they trudged forward, every step feeling more difficult than the last. "Mama, I'm tired," Bohdan whined, his small legs struggling to keep up with the relentless pace. His usual boundless energy had faded, replaced by a weariness that made him cling to his mother even tighter. "I know, my love," Iryna said, her voice gentle but firm. "But we have to keep going. We can't stop now." Sofia reached out and took Bohdan's other hand, her expression determined despite the fear that still lingered in her eyes. "I'll help you, Bohdan," she said softly. "We'll walk together." Bohdan nodded, his bottom lip quivering, but he didn't complain again. The three of them moved as one, united in their resolve to keep going, to reach safety. But as the day wore on, the journey began to take its toll. The roads were filled with others who, like them, had left everything behind in a desperate bid to escape the encroaching war. Some were on foot, like Iryna and her children, while others had managed to bring their cars, though most were now abandoned, out of fuel or broken down. The sight of these vehicles, once symbols of freedom and movement, now left to rust on the side of the road, was a stark reminder of how quickly their world had changed. They passed through small villages, each more desolate than the last. Shops were boarded up, homes abandoned in haste, and the few remaining residents stared out at them with hollow eyes, as if the life had been drained from them. Occasionally, they would come across makeshift camps, where groups of refugees huddled together for warmth and safety, sharing what little they had left. Iryna felt a deep sense of despair growing within her. Every step forward seemed to bring them closer to an uncertain future, and farther away from the life they had known. She glanced down at Sofia, who was doing her best to keep Bohdan's spirits up by pointing out things along the way. An old tree with twisted branches, a flock of birds flying overhead. But even Sofia's energy was fading. As the sun reached its zenith, Iryna realized they needed to find somewhere to rest, if only for a little while. Bohdan's face was flushed with heat, and his small frame was trembling with exhaustion. They came across an old farmhouse, its windows shattered and its door hanging askew, but it offered some shelter from the relentless sun. "Let's stop here for a bit," Iryna said, leading them inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of abandonment, but it was quiet, and for that, Iryna was grateful. They sat down on the dusty floor, and Iryna pulled out a small loaf of bread she had packed before they left home. It was stale, but it was all they had. She broke it into pieces, giving the largest portions to Sofia and Bohdan. Bohdan took the bread with a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered, leaning against her as he ate. Iryna wrapped her arm around him, holding him close as if her embrace could protect him from the horrors they had left behind. Sofia nibbled at her bread, her eyes scanning the room. "Do you think we'll be safe here for a while?" she asked. Her voice filled with a maturity that both saddened and impressed Iryna. "For a little while," Iryna replied, brushing a strand of hair from Sofia's face. "But we can't stay too long. We need to keep moving if we want to reach Poland." Sofia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I wish Papa was here," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "He would know what to do." Iryna felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of Dmytro. She missed him more than she could put into words. The steady presence he had always provided, the way he could calm her fears with just a look. But she couldn't let herself dwell on that now. She had to stay strong for her children. "I know, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But Papa would want us to be brave, wouldn't he? He would want us to keep going." Sofia looked up at her, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes," she whispered, nodding. "He would." They rested for a while longer, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old farmhouse settling into the ground. Iryna allowed herself a few moments of rest, but her mind was racing, thinking about the road ahead. The journey to Poland was still long, and the dangers they might face were unpredictable. But they had no choice. They had to keep moving. After an hour or so, Bohdan began to stir, his small body shifting restlessly against her. Iryna pressed a hand to his forehead and felt a wave of concern wash over her. His skin was hot to the 9.9, far warmer than it should have been. "Bohdan, how are you feeling?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Bohdan opened his eyes, his lashes fluttering as he tried to focus on her face. "I'm tired, Mama," he murmured, his voice weak. "And my head hurts." Iryna's heart clenched with fear. She had hoped that the rest would help him recover, but now she could see that his condition was worsening. The heat, the exhaustion, and the stress of the journey were taking their toll on his small body. "We need to keep going," Iryna said, her voice filled with determination. She didn't want to alarm Sofia, but she knew they had to find help, and soon. "We'll find someone who can help you, Bohdan. I promise." Sofia looked at her mother, sensing the urgency in her tone. She didn't ask questions, but simply stood up and took her brother's hand, her own small face set with determination. "I'll help you, Bohdan," she said quietly. "We'll find someone." Iryna felt a swell of pride and sorrow at her daughter's bravery. "Let's go," she said, lifting Bohdan into her arms. He was getting too big for her to carry comfortably, but she didn't care. She would carry him as far as she needed to. They left the farmhouse and continued down the road, the sun now sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. As they walked, Iryna kept an eye out for any signs of help. A village, a doctor, anyone who could assist them. But the road stretched on, seemingly endless. And as the hours passed, Bohdan's condition worsened. His face was flushed, his skin burning with fever, and his breathing had become shallow and labored. Iryna's heart pounded in her chest, her fear growing with every step. She could feel the weight of her son in her arms, his small body growing heavier as he slipped in and out of consciousness. Just as Iryna was beginning to lose hope, she saw a group of people gathered ahead on the road. They were huddled around a fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. As they drew closer, Iryna's eyes widened with relief. Among them was a woman wearing a white coat, a symbol that she was a doctor or nurse. "Please," Iryna called out, her voice trembling with desperation. "Please, my son is sick. Can you help us?" The group turned to look at them, and the woman in the white coat stepped forward. Her eyes filled with concern as she saw the limp child in Iryna's arms. "Bring him here," the woman said, her voice calm and authoritative. She led them to a spot by the fire, where she quickly laid out a blanket for Bohdan to rest on. Iryna gently placed Bohdan down, her hands shaking as she watched the woman work. The doctor quickly assessed his condition, checking his pulse, feeling his forehead, and listening to his breathing. "He's burning up," the doctor said, her voice grave. "He's dehydrated and exhausted. We need to bring his fever down and get fluids into him." Iryna nodded, her heart in her throat. "Please do whatever you can," she begged, tears welling up in her eyes. "He's all I have." The doctor didn't waste any time. She instructed Iryna and Sofia to help cool Bohdan down by wiping his face and neck with damp cloths, while she prepared some medicine from her kit. The minutes felt like hours as they worked, Iryna's hands trembling as she wiped away the sweat from her son's brow. Chapter 4. Desperate Struggles. The night pressed in around them, the darkness broken only by the flickering flames of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Iryna's heart pounded as she knelt beside Bohdan, who lay on a blanket near the fire. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and every so often, a low moan escaped his lips. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, worked quickly, her hands steady as she prepared a makeshift IV to rehydrate the boy. Sofia sat close by, her small hands trembling as she held a cup of water to Bohdan's lips, trying to get him to drink. Her eyes were wide with fear, and though she said nothing, Iryna could see the worry etched on her daughter's young face. Iryna herself was doing her best to hold it together, but the sight of her son in such a fragile state tore at her heart. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" Sofia whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. The doctor glanced at Sofia, her expression unreadable. "We're doing everything we can," she replied, her voice gentle yet firm. "He's a strong boy. We need to get his fever down and keep him hydrated." Iryna watched as the doctor carefully inserted the IV needle into Bohdan's small arm. The sight of the needle piercing his skin made Iryna wince, but she knew it was necessary. The doctor then handed her a bottle of medicine, instructing her to give Bohdan a few drops every couple of hours to help lower his fever. As the night wore on, the group of refugees around the fire fell into an uneasy silence. Each was lost in their own thoughts, their faces reflecting the same mix of exhaustion and fear that Iryna felt deep in her bones. They were all strangers brought together by the same desperate circumstances. And while they offered each other what little support they could, the atmosphere was heavy with the knowledge that they were far from safety. Bohdan's fever continued to rage through the night. He tossed and turned on the blanket, his small body drenched in sweat. Iryna stayed by his side, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering words of comfort, even though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. Sofia refused to leave her brother's side, her small hands clutching his, as if her touch alone could keep him tethered to this world. "Please, Bohdan, stay with us," Iryna whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We're going to get through this. We're going to find your papa, and we're going to be a family again." But as the hours dragged on, Iryna's hope began to waver. Bohdan's condition wasn't improving, and she could see the worry in the doctor's eyes, despite her attempts to remain composed. The reality of their situation was sinking in. If Bohdan didn't get better soon, they might lose him. As dawn approached, the sky slowly lightened, casting a soft, grey glow over the campsite. Iryna hadn't slept. She had barely moved from Bohdan's side, her exhaustion eclipsed by the fear gnawing at her insides. Sofia had finally dozed off, curled up beside Bohdan, her face still lined with worry even in sleep. The doctor approached Iryna, her expression serious. "His fever is still too high," she said quietly. "We need to cool him down more, but we're running low on water. I've done everything I can with the supplies I have." Iryna's heart clenched. "What else can we do?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. The doctor hesitated, then glanced toward the nearby woods. "There's a stream not far from here. If we can get more water, it might help. We need to keep his body temperature down." Iryna nodded, determination hardening in her chest. "I'll go," she said, standing up, though her legs felt like lead. "I'll get the water." "No, you need to stay with your son," the doctor said firmly. "I'll send someone else." But Iryna shook her head. "No, he's my son. I need to do this. Please, just tell me where to go." The doctor looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "It's just through the woods, about 1 kilometer that way," she said, pointing in the direction of the stream. "But be careful. We don't know who or what might be out there." Iryna took a deep breath and nodded, steeling herself for the task ahead. She couldn't let fear stop her now. She had to do whatever it took to save her son. "I'll be back as soon as I can," Iryna said, turning to Sofia, who had woken up and was watching her mother with wide eyes. "Stay with Bohdan, okay? Help the doctor. I won't be long." Sofia nodded, though her eyes were filled with fear. "Be careful, Mama," she whispered. Iryna leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead, then bent over Bohdan, brushing a kiss across his burning brow. "Hold on, my love," she whispered. "Mama will be back soon." With that, Iryna grabbed an empty canteen and set off toward the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. The early morning air was cold, and the ground was wet with dew, but Iryna barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed with Bohdan, with the urgency of getting back to him with the water he so desperately needed. The woods were dense, the trees towering above her, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the morning light. Iryna pushed through the underbrush, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her heart jump, but she forced herself to keep going. After what felt like an eternity, she finally heard the sound of running water. Relief washed over her as she pushed through the last thicket of bushes and emerged at the edge of a small stream. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones, and Iryna quickly filled the canteen. But as she knelt by the stream, a sense of unease settled over her. The woods were too quiet. the usual sounds of birds and insects strangely absent. Iryna's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and she instinctively glanced over her shoulder. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. Iryna's heart skipped a beat as she caught sight of the soldier's uniform, her mind immediately flashing back to the checkpoint where Dmytro had been taken from them. But this was no Ukrainian soldier. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a dark beard. His eyes were hard, cold, and Iryna felt a chill run down her spine as she realized he was a Russian soldier. For a moment, neither of them moved, each assessing the other. Iryna's mind raced, trying to think of what to do. She had no weapon, no means of defending herself if this soldier decided to harm her. Her only thought was of Bohdan and Sofia, waiting for her by the fire. "Stop!" the soldier commanded, his voice rough and accented. He took a step forward, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Iryna's breath caught in her throat, her body tense with fear. She clutched the canteen to her chest, her thoughts racing. What did he want? What would he do to her? "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just need to get back to my children." The soldier's eyes flicked to the canteen, then back to Iryna. For a moment, his expression softened, but only slightly. "Where are they?" he asked, his tone suspicious. Just through the woods," Iryna replied, her voice shaking. "My son is sick. He needs water." The soldier stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Iryna's surprise, he lowered his rifle and gestured for her to leave. "Go," he said gruffly. "And be quick." Iryna didn't need to be told twice. She stood up, clutching the canteen, and ran back through the woods as fast as her legs would carry her. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging through her veins. She didn't dare look back, afraid that the soldier might change his mind. When she finally broke through the trees and saw the glow of the fire, she nearly collapsed with relief. The doctor looked up as Iryna stumbled into the clearing, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of the canteen. "I got the water," Iryna gasped, her chest heaving. "Here, take it." The doctor didn't waste any time. She took the canteen from Iryna and immediately began using the water to cool Bohdan down. Iryna knelt beside her son, her hands trembling as she helped the doctor work. Bohdan's breathing was still shallow, but as they applied the cool water to his feverish skin, his body began to relax, the tension easing from his small frame. His temperature slowly began to drop, and Iryna felt a flicker of hope take root in her heart. "Thank you," Iryna whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she looked at the doctor. "Thank you so much." Chapter 5. A Glimmer of Hope. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting a soft golden light over the makeshift campsite. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing faintly in the dawn. Iryna sat beside Bohdan, her eyes red from exhaustion and worry. But a tentative sense of relief had begun to settle in her heart. The worst of Bohdan's fever seemed to have passed, and though he was still weak, his breathing was steadier, and his small face no longer burned with the heat of his illness. Sofia was curled up beside him, her head resting on his arm, both of them finally getting some much-needed rest. Iryna brushed a hand over Bohdan's damp hair, her heart swelling with gratitude for the doctor's help and the small miracle that had brought her son through the night. The doctor, who had stayed by Bohdan's side throughout the night, sat down beside Iryna, her expression weary but relieved. "He's a strong little boy," she said quietly, her voice filled with the kind of tired warmth that comes from seeing hope where there once was none. "He still needs rest and care, but I think he'll pull through." Iryna nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. She reached out and grasped the doctor's hand, squeezing it in silent thanks. The woman had done more than just provide medical care. She had given Iryna and Sofia hope when they had feared it was slipping away. "Thank you," Iryna finally managed to whisper, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." The doctor smiled faintly, shaking her head. "There's no need for thanks," she replied, her voice gentle. "We're all in this together. Helping each other is the only way any of us will make it through this." Iryna nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of solidarity. The war had brought unimaginable horrors and hardships into their lives, but it had also brought moments like these. Moments where the kindness of strangers reminded her that humanity still existed, even in the darkest of times. "Where are you from?" the doctor asked. "What part of Ukraine?" "Mariinka," Iryna responded with a nostalgic smile. "I can see you really miss it," the doctor observed. "That's where I grew up, where my parents grew up. It is where I got married and started a family." "So Mariinka is not just a town. It's your home," the doctor surmised. As the sun continued to rise, the other refugees began to stir, their faces etched with fatigue, but also with a determination to keep moving. They, too, had witnessed Bohdan's struggle through the night, and now, seeing him resting more peacefully, a quiet sense of hope seemed to ripple through the group. Iryna knew they couldn't stay in the forest much longer. They were still too close to the conflict zone, and every day they lingered brought new dangers. But at least now, with Bohdan on the mend, they could continue their journey with renewed strength. As they prepared to leave, the doctor handed Iryna a small vial of medicine and a few additional supplies she had managed to scavenge from her kit. "This should help keep his fever down if it spikes again," she said. "And make sure he drinks plenty of water. He needs to stay hydrated." Iryna accepted the supplies with a grateful nod. "We'll be careful," she promised. "And we'll keep moving. Thank you again for everything." The doctor gave her a brief, tired smile. "Safe travels," she said. "I hope you and your children find peace on the other side." With a final nod, Iryna gathered their belongings, making sure the canteen was securely fastened to her bag. She gently woke Sofia, who stirred and blinked up at her mother with bleary eyes. "How's Bohdan?" Sofia asked, her voice hoarse with sleep. "He's doing better," Iryna replied, her voice filled with as much reassurance as she could muster. "But we need to keep going, sweetheart. We need to find a safer place." Sofia nodded, her expression serious as she glanced over at Bohdan, who was still sleeping. "I'll help you carry him, Mama," she offered, already moving to pack up their few belongings. Iryna's heart swelled with pride and love for her daughter. Sofia had been so strong throughout their journey, and her resilience had been a source of strength for Iryna as well. "Thank you, my brave girl," Iryna said softly, giving her daughter a quick hug. Together, they gently lifted Bohdan, who was still too weak to walk on his own. He murmured softly in his sleep, his head resting against Iryna's shoulder as they carefully made their way out of the forest. The journey ahead was still daunting, but as they walked, Iryna felt a renewed sense of purpose. The worst might not be over, but they had made it through one of the darkest nights of their lives. And that in itself was a victory. With every step, she reminded herself of what they were fighting for. A future, however uncertain, where they could be together as a family again. The landscape around them was stark and quiet, the air heavy with the remnants of war. As they moved farther west, they began to see more signs of the conflict. Burnt-out vehicles, abandoned homes, and the occasional distant sound of artillery fire. It was a constant reminder of the fragility of their situation, but Iryna refused to let it break her resolve. As they walked, they passed other groups of refugees, each one bearing the same look of exhaustion and determination. Some were on foot like them, while others had managed to secure rides on overcrowded trucks or buses. Iryna exchanged brief, weary nods with those they passed, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. By midday, Bohdan began to stir more fully, his eyes fluttering open as he mumbled for water. Iryna quickly set him down on a patch of grass and handed him the canteen. He drank greedily, his small hands trembling as he held the metal container. "Mama," Bohdan whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Are we still going to Poland?" Iryna knelt beside him, brushing a hand through his hair. "Yes, my love," she said gently. "We're still going to Poland. We're going to find a safe place. And then we'll wait for Papa to come to us." Bohdan nodded, his eyes closing again as he leaned against her. "I miss Papa," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "I know," Iryna whispered, holding him close. "I miss him too, but we'll see him again, I promise." As the day wore on, they continued their journey, stopping only briefly to rest and give Bohdan more medicine. The road stretched on, seemingly endless, but the thought of finding safety and reuniting with Dmytro kept them going. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the road, they reached the outskirts of a small town. It was eerily quiet, the streets empty and the windows of the houses dark. But it seemed relatively untouched by the war, and Iryna hoped they might find shelter here for the night. They cautiously entered the town, moving through the empty streets with a sense of unease. The silence was unnerving, but Iryna was determined to find a place where they could rest safely. As they walked, they passed a small church, its door slightly ajar. "Let's check inside," Iryna suggested, her voice low. "We might be able to rest there?" Sofia nodded, her eyes scanning the surroundings warily as they approached the church. Iryna pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. The interior of the church was dimly lit by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows, casting colourful patterns on the worn wooden pews. The air inside was cool and quiet, the silence almost comforting after the noise and chaos of the past few days. Iryna led them to a corner near the altar, where they laid out a blanket for Bohdan to rest on. As they settled in, Iryna felt a sense of calm wash over her. The church, with its ancient stone walls and the soft glow of the fading light, felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could finally catch their breath, even if just for a moment. They shared a simple meal of bread and water, and for the first time in days, Iryna felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Hope that they might make it to Poland. Hope that Dmytro was still alive and fighting to return to them. hope that one day they could rebuild their lives in peace. As night fell and the church grew darker, Iryna and Sofia curled up beside Bohdan, who was already asleep, his breathing more even and steady than it had been in days. Iryna wrapped her arms around both of her children, holding them close as they drifted off to sleep. In the quiet darkness of the church, Iryna allowed herself to dream of a future beyond the war. A future where they were safe, together, and free from the fear that had haunted them for so long. She knew the road ahead was still fraught with danger and uncertainty. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to believe that they would make it through. The next morning would bring new challenges, but as Iryna closed her eyes, she held on to the hope that had carried them this far. The hope that one day they would find their way back to each other, and that the war would be nothing more than a distant memory.